Hey everybody. Hope everyone's having a good Friday. I'd like to talk to you today about part two of tracking your board straight. Last time we got together on Facebook Live, I talked about weight distribution. And that's a step I don't usually discuss when I'm talking about tracking your board straight. But having just come back from a training camp where we did a lot of work on it, I realized that some people have a bit of difficulty with maintaining their weight evenly between their feet when they're on their board, and then when you ask them to weight one rail or the other to help with steering, they're confused about how to do that. And so I thought we would spend some time in the last session talking about weight distribution. And it's also really good because when we were talking about the catch drill on land, we wanted to get our weight forward in front of our toes. And so talking about weight distribution helped shed some light on what you want to feel in your feet when you are doing that drill as well. So I'm going to review that real quickly, and then I'm going to get into the first tool that we use for tracking our board straight, which is called paddling close to the rail. All right, so hopefully everybody's joined us who's going to join us, and let's get started, okay? So I'm just going to move this out of the way. You can see I've drawn a board on the floor with green tape, and I'm going to use that when we start talking about where to place the paddle, so that you'll get an idea of where the rail is and what I'm doing to get the blade close to that rail. Quick review on weight distribution. Basically, when you're standing on your feet, you can have your weight, more on one foot, more on the other foot, or you can have it evenly distributed between 2 feet and both feet. You can have your weight more forward. You can have your weight in the middle of your feet, so it's spread out evenly across your entire foot from the front of from your heel to your toes, or you can have it back on your heels a bit. You can see when I do it, I'm either losing my balance forward a bit or losing my balance back a bit, or I'm perfectly comfortable and upright and balanced, right? So let's look at that from the side in the context of what we've been discussing and all of the drills we've talked about so far. Weight forward is simply, you're leaning forward and more of your weight is on your toes than on your heels, but your heels are still on the floor or on the ground. You're not like up, your heels aren't up in the air. They're on the ground, but more of your weight is on your toes. And if you look at, the way I'm standing right now, you can see that I'm actually leaning forward, that there's a very noticeable lean in my legs, forward in my legs. I'm kind of preventing myself from falling forward by arching my back a little bit to keep my back straight. I'm leaning back with my back and my head a bit to keep me from toppling. But you can see that my legs are actually leaning forward a bit. And it's not hard to imagine that if I were on my board and I actually was starting to reach forward with my upper body, that I'm going to fall forward, right? So that's my weight on my toes. My weight on my heels is what we do naturally without thinking about it. My weight spread out over my entire foot is what we do naturally without thinking about it. It's spread out between my heels and my toes, evenly distributed, and I have good balance. And then if my weight's back on my heels a bit, I feel like I might topple backwards, and that's real easy for someone to come along and just push me backwards. And you don't ever want to be in that position in any kind of sport, right? You always want to be actually leaning forward. You want to be the one that has that forward momentum, that forward drive. You want to be pushing your opponent backward. It doesn't matter pretty well whatever sport you're doing, whether it's a contact sport or even a non-contact sport like volleyball or something. You don't want to be leaning back. You want to be leaning forward so that you're forward into the play that you're making. And then when we look at weight distribution between, from one foot to the other, it's this pretty simple matter. Our weight is either all evenly spread out between both feet, and so we can be weight spread out across our feet from front to back on our feet and evenly distributed left foot, right foot. Or we can be forward on our toes a bit, right? So I feel like I'm going to topple forward, and with weight distributed evenly between left foot and right foot. Or we can be back on our heels but weight is distributed evenly between left foot and right foot. Or we can be more weight on the left foot, more weight on the right foot, and then any one of those combinations, more weight on my right foot, weight forward, more weight on my right foot but weight distributed evenly across my entire foot, or more weight on my right foot but more weight on my heels, right? So those are sort of our combinations on how we can distribute our weight on our feet. And when we're on our board, we want to have those bent legs. Bent legs to some degree are really useful. We don't want to have straight legs. So bent legs, and then I like to say that you get a little extra ankle flexion, get your knees in front of your toes. That really, as soon as I do that, my weight's forward on my foot. My weight distribution is forward. But right now, my weight is distributed evenly between my left foot and my right foot. Right? So that's basically your paddling stance, is your weight's forward, and then when you reach forward with your paddle and get the blade to plant in the water, the weight goes on the paddle. And I'll just show you against the wall here so I don't fall over. So I'm standing up, I got my leg bend, I get a little extra ankle flexion, I reach forward, and I start to topple as I reach forward. But I'm in this great position now with a little bit of rotation so that all my weight is going to go on the blade when I catch. And remember, everyone knows how to brace. If you're losing your balance, you slap your blade down the surface of the water and that supports you, right? That's a brace. But when you catch the water, when you get into that unstable position and the blade takes your body weight, that's a brace too, right? It's supporting your body weight every bit the same way that it's supporting you when you're leaning on it on the side. And that brace, the difference being that this brace is actually going to produce some power, right? So that's weight distribution in a nutshell. And the reason we talked about it is today I'm going to show you something that involves getting outside the board with our upper body. So we want, if you can see now I'm standing on my board, these green lines that are on the board, and if the comments are on your screen, you can swipe. I don't know whether you swipe left or you swipe right, but you can get the comments off so that you can see the entire board. The green tape is the rails of my board, and then you'll notice that they start to get narrower in front of me, right? Just like your board would. So if you in this drill, we're going to have our weight distributed evenly between both feet, but our upper body is going to get out over the water. So we're going to lean, our paddling side shoulder is going to hang out over the side of the board, right? And as it's doing that, our top hand is going to be above our bottom hand. And you can see when my paddling side hand and shoulder are hanging out over the rail of the board, you can see I'm kind of like my whole side is kind of hanging down and kind of out more over the water than it being in the center of the board. When I'm in this position, you can see that my head is over, my chin is over my shoulder, my head is out over the water as well, and then my top shoulder, it's not, it's not out over the water, like it really can't be there, but you can see that my shoulders are in two different planes, right? My paddling side shoulder is lower, my inside or top shoulder is higher. And then my top hand, just with the natural 5 to 10 degree bend that you're supposed to have in your top arm. Remember, you don't want it ever straight. You want that 5 to 10 degrees, and it stays at that angle through the entire stroke, right? It just, your hand does little circles, but your arm does not do this when you're paddling. That introduces the use of small muscles, your biceps and triceps. So we just want to keep our top hand at the same angle all the time, our hands doing circles. So you can see that when I'm in this position, I'm hanging out over the rail of the board, and my shoulders are, paddling side shoulders lower than my top shoulder. We call that kind of shoulders stacked position. My head's out over the water too, and my top hand is kind of over my bottom hand, right? So I'll get the paddle in my hand now, and just show you that position. And this is the position that we get into when we're doing our catch drill, right? We have all our weight forward, and we start to reach forward, and we lose our balance, and the ground catches our body weight, or if we're on our board, the water catches the blade, gathers water on it, and that holds our body weight. And there you can see that, from the view that you have of my paddle is vertical. It's a 90-degree angle from the ground up to my top hand, right? It's not inside the board like that. It's vertical. And you can see that my body is hanging out over the rail of the board, and that my head is hanging out over the rail of the board, my paddling side shoulder is hanging out over the rail of the board, my whole paddling side arm. My top shoulder is still inside the board, but it's closer to the right rail of the board than it is the left rail. And then my hand, with just that normal 5-degree, maybe 10-degree bend in my top arm, my hand is out over the water as well. Okay, and we can say that is being squared up. Now, when you catch the water, when the blade goes in the water, I'm just going to move back a little bit. This is the position that we want to be in to generate force, right? To move our board forward. First of all our body weight is forward and getting on the paddle, and we're forcing the paddle to take our body weight. So we're loading body weight on the blade. But the direction of forces is really important here too. When the blade is squared up like this, right? It's going in the water with a positive blade angle, like this, and some of the force is going to be directed down, directly down into the water or into the floor here, and some of it is going to be directed backwards. Okay, those are the two components of forces that are being produced. We got forces being produced back against the water that's loaded on the face of the blade, and we've got forces that are directed down. The downward forces are going to lift up the board. And lifting up the board is great, and it's especially great if we can get weight off of our board and onto our paddle, because it makes the board sit up in the water higher and skitter across the top of the water, which is less resistance to forward movement in the water, which is going to make it easier to pull across the water faster, right? And then the backwards forces, the forces directed in this way, are moving the board forward. So we're lifting up the board and moving it forward. And if the blade is going in the water anything other than squared up, if it's going in the water like that, there's less force directed down. There's still a good amount of force directed back, but there's also some forces that are directed away from the board in this direction that is going to actually push the board more to the opposite side. The other thing that I'll show you right now too, since you can see the tape, which is the rail on my board, if my hand is inside the board, my top hand is inside the board and my blade is going in at this angle, my blade is going in the water further from the rail of the board, right? So there's the rail of the board, there's my blade. It's much further from the rail of the board than it is when it's like this. And if we're going to run our board straight, we want to minimize the turning effect of each stroke. And the way to minimize the turning effect is to paddle as close to the center of the board as possible. So you can't paddle in here because there's a board there. So you want to paddle as close to the rail as possible. And that's going to minimize the turning effect of each stroke. If you paddle further out from the board, it adds to the turning effect. That's why narrow boards are easier to track than wider boards, is because if you're paddling along the rail on a narrow board, you're paddling closer to the center of the board than if you're paddling along the rail of a wider board. You're paddling further from the center, right? So we want to paddle as close to the center line of the board as we can, and at the same time, we want to make sure that the forces that are being produced by our stroke are down and back, and that there's no forces produced in that direction that's going to add to the turning effect of our board going in this direction, right? So we want to be snugged up against the rail of the board. And the reason I drew the lines of the rails on the board on the floor here is because when your paddle's going in the water, the blade, the side of the blade, right up here, okay, the side that's going to be closest to the board, that wants to be snugged up right against the board where the board's getting narrower in front of you, okay? So at the front part of the board towards the nose of the board, it's narrower. And you want that part of your blade to be snugged up right against the board. You don't want to be whacking it, and you're going to whack it sometimes. Most boards you'll see have little white marks up at the front of the board where people have hit this side of their board when they're paddling. I hate them, but I still get some of them. I like to buff them out as soon as I get them because they're an eyesore, but you try to minimize those scuff marks, right? You don't want to be whacking the side of the board all the time. But you want to be as close to it as possible. I mean, we're talking millimeters. You want to be just as close to it as possible. Okay? And if you enter the water there and bury your blade there, right, as far forward as you possibly can, by the time you get to the part of the board where the board is wider, closer to you, the blade's buried in the water, and all you've got by the rail of the board is shaft, right? And so it's just along here, at this part of the stroke, it's just shaft that's running along the side of the board, right? So your blade is actually, your blade's not that far from the side of the board. It's actually, or from the middle of the board, sorry. It's not that far from the middle of the board. It's actually that far from the board. Do you see the difference? There's about a, well, there's basically, there's half the blade width difference that you can get your blade closer to the center of the board. Just by getting it this side of the blade snugged right up against the board. Where can you see that there? Snugged right up against the board when it goes in the water, and getting it buried quickly. That means that it's going to travel. So that, you know, there's the center of the board right there. So you're about a foot from the center of the board, maybe less, right? When it goes in on the board that I've drawn on the floor here, and it's going to stay at that distance the whole way. It doesn't have to go out around the rail because it gets buried. If it gets buried quickly, it can be that close to the center of the board through the entire stroke. Because when it gets to the fat part of the board, the blade is buried and it's just the shaft now that's kissing along the side of the board. And again, you don't want your shaft to scrub the side. That's not going to be good for your board, and it's not going to be good for your paddle. You get a lot of wear on your paddle, you know, that's when a paddle breaks, right? So you don't ever want it to scrub. It might just kiss the board the odd time. I look at my paddles, some of the ones that I've used a lot, and I'll see just a little bit of wear, just the slightest bit of wear there, like just you can see that something's touched it every once in a while, and it's come into contact with the side of the board ever so gently, you know, every 100 strokes or something. But most of the time, I'm like a millimeter from the side of the board, from the rail of the board there. And that's how close you want to be. You don't want to be 2 millimeters or 2 centimeters or 2 inches. You want to be snugged right up against it, because that narrows the distance from the center of the board to where your paddle is, and that minimizes the turning effect, okay? So that's where we want to that's where we want the blade to be going into the water. But we want it to be going in the water, and we want to get that lean out over the water to accomplish this. Right? Remember, this only happens if we can lean out over the water. If we can get our paddling side shoulder out over the water. If we can get our head out over the water. If we can get our top shoulder above our bottom shoulder, like our shoulder stacked. If we can get our top hand out over the water. Remember, we want to get our top hand out over the water without having to go like this. If you're getting your paddle squared up at the catch by standing up straight in your board and moving your hand or your top arm across your face like this to get the blade in the water, if you're doing that, you know, if you're going across your face like that and paddling with your arm going across your body like that, that's very wrong. It's actually puts your shoulder in a really compromising position, and you'll feel it when you're paddling. You have less power and you get more pain, and you're risking a really bad shoulder injury to do that. And I don't know the exact muscles that are involved. We can talk to Karen or John Batson or somebody like that. They can tell us, but it's a weak position and it's a compromising position. It's you're risking injury doing that. But if you have your body over the water and your top arm at the same angle it is here as it would be here, right? That's a normal, strong position for your top arm. It's just out over the water now because your body's out over the water. If that's the position that you're in, it's strong and it's durable. It's not going to get injured here. Okay, you're not compromising the integrity of the shoulder joint at all. All right, so this is the position you want to get in, and you want to get in this position maintaining even distribution of weight between your left and your right foot. Right? I think I mentioned in the last video that somebody, and I think for some reason I think it was June, and I singled June out because I know he can take it. And he was having a hard time with this because he was leaning out over the water from his feet. He was leaning on his right side foot while he was paddling on the right, or his left side foot while he was paddling on the left, and his rail was dropping in the water. And we'll talk about using our rails to steer in the next video, but I'll just tell you that if your paddling side rail is lower in the water, it's actually increasing the turning effect to the opposite side, to the left side, right? If you're paddling the right, it's increasing the turning effect to the left. Okay, it directs your board to the opposite side. So you're making things more difficult for yourself, and you're running an unlevel board, which is going to present some balance issues for you. And generally speaking, a level board is a faster board, right? So you want your weight distribution, instead of being, reaching out to the side from your paddling side foot, you want your weight to stay evenly distributed between your 2 feet, and you want to kind of flex at your obliques. So you're kind of crunching your obliques on your paddling side, and you can stick your hips out to the side a bit to help up to the opposite side of it, to counterbalance a bit. And you can do those things if you're mindful of your weight distribution, as you should be if you did your homework from the last video. You should be able to feel that you can get into that position with your lower body without changing the weight distribution between your 2 feet. Right? It should be the same as when it's equally distributed between 2 feet standing up straight. You can get into that position, and it should be, again, equally distributed between your 2 feet. Okay? That's the position that you want to be in at the catch, in normal paddling and paddling close to the rail. Okay? That's the position. So, if you're trying to get into this position on land, then I'd suggest doing it on land first, because it's always easier to control how you're standing when balance isn't an issue, when your board's not shaking underneath you. So if you're locked down off the water right now, then land drills are all you have. It's worth spending a little time just doing this simple motion, doing your weight distribution exercises to differentiate between weight forward, weight back, weight distributed evenly between 2 feet, like when I'm standing talking to you right now, and then the side-to-side distribution. Weight on both feet equally distributed, weight more to one foot, weight more to the other foot. Okay, play around with all of those different distributions of body weight, so you can identify when you're on your board later on what body weight distribution you actually have. And just this simple exercise of getting to know that better is going to make things easier for you when you get on your board. But if we're looking at the paddling part of what to do with a paddle in your hand now, get in front of a full-length mirror or a mirror, or get somebody to video you, and just practice your weight distribution being the same between your feet while you move your body. Right? So you're going to lean your upper body out to the side a bit, hang your paddling side shoulder out over the rail, lower your paddling side shoulder, like take your shoulders from being right shoulder, left shoulder in the same plane, to get them in two different planes where your paddling side shoulder is lower, your inside shoulder is higher. Get in that position, get your head out over your paddling side shoulder. I like to look at, the cue for me is my chin is over my shoulder. It's almost like chin and shoulder are almost touching, right? Get squared up, and again, think about doing that without changing the weight distribution between your feet. So you can imagine being on one of those balance boards or wobble boards and achieving a balanced state. And I'm not suggesting you try this because they're really twitchy and you'll have a real hard time. but just, use that analogy, picture that, imagine that. And imagine achieving an equilibrium, a perfect balance between, on that wobble board while you're standing up straight, and then not disturbing that balance and getting in the position of hanging out over the rail. That's all you're trying to do when you paddle close to the rail. And truthfully, that's all you're trying to do when you paddle, period. 90% of the strokes you take, this is the position that you should be in. All right? That is the most powerful position. That is also the best position for tracking your board straight, because you're minimizing the turning effect created by each stroke. You're paddling as close to the rail as you can. And in fact, if your blade enters the water where the edge of the blade, the inside edge of the blade is tucked right up against the side of the board, by the time it's buried, if it gets buried quickly, your shaft is going to be against the rail now, and that means that half your blade is under the board and closer to the center line of the board than you really realize it is, okay? And it's really going to minimize your turning effect. All right? Now, if you can get to that position by practicing on land, right, then take it a step further, and this is not paddling for power and going fast, but this is paddling for steering. You don't want to paddle like this all the time, but if you're paddling along and you want to really minimize the turning effect to the opposite side, or you want to bring your board back to the paddling side, say it's starting to wander, say I'm paddling to the right, the board starts to wander to the left, and I want to bring it back to the right without changing sides, you can go from paddling like this, squared up, with the blade against the rail or right along the rail. You can actually get out of the water more, out over the water more, and you can get your blade to go under the board. Okay? Now it's still going to catch the water in the same place, because the edge of the blade can only it can't get any closer to the board than it is when you catch, right? It can't go inside the board more. But as soon as that blade gets buried, if you're outside the board with your body weight now, and notice that my top hand is outside the board more than my bottom hand, right? If you can get into this position, get even more outside the water, when you start pulling your stroke under in the middle of the stroke, you can see your blade is really underneath the board. In fact, the inside edge of your paddle is right along the center line of the board. So that really reduces the turning effect. So if you can, for 90% of the time that you're paddling, this is where you want to be. And that should be good enough to really minimize the turning effect, especially if you're on a board that isn't too wide. That should be good to a large degree minimize the turning effect that's going to make your board go to the opposite side. But if you need to, and I'm not suggesting you do it for, like an indefinite period of time, but for a few strokes here or there, you can actually make an adjustment where you can get outside the board even more and get that blade to go underneath the board. And it's going to minimize the turning effect further, okay? So paddling close to the rail, paddling underneath the rail is the first tool in your steering toolkit, okay? And those two things are going to really reduce the turning effect that your board has. So they're the first two things that you'd go to track your board straight. All right? And it just so happens that paddling close to the rail is also the best practice for paddling fast in a forward direction. But it also minimizes the turning effect, and then getting under the board minimizes that turning effect even more. Now, if you're on the wider the board you are on, the harder it is to paddle close to the rail, right? Because it means the further you got to get out. This board I drew on the ground here looks like it's about a 22, maybe a 23-inch wide board. I didn't measure, but I'm just looking at it. If you're on a 28 or something, you're out over the water a little bit more to get tucked in against the side of the board. And that's just the way it is, right? And so you really got to work on your weight distribution to make sure that you can get out that far without putting more weight on the paddling side foot and keeping your weight evenly distributed between your 2 feet. Okay? And then if you're on a wide board, it becomes even harder now to get underneath the board, right? It gets really hard. But I'm going to show you something that we can do in the next video. I'm going to show you a trick that will help you get under the board, make it more easy for you to get under the board, especially if you're on a wider board. And then it's also it involves leaning your board. And just by leaning your board, you're correcting your steering anyway, because tilting the board will have an effect on the steering. But if you tilt and weight the opposite rail, it's going to actually, you can see that if your weight is distributed evenly, if your weight's distributed evenly between 2 feet, you're running a very level board, right? So this is the left rail of my board, this is the right rail of my board. My weight's evenly distributed, my board is level. If I put more weight on my right foot, my left foot, my left rail sinks, my right rail rises. If my right rail is come up like that, it kind of exposes the underside of my board, and it's going to make it easier to paddle underneath the board. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at next time when we look at weighting the opposite rail to help you go straight, or to help bring your board back towards the paddling side. If it started to wander to the opposite side, to bring it back to the paddling side without changing sides to do it. Okay? So we'll be looking at weighting the opposite rail. And if we're going to weight the opposite rail, just thinking ahead, you're going to have to realize that today was all about keeping our weight evenly distributed between our left and our right foot. Didn't matter whether we're paddling on the right side, whether we're paddling on the left side. It was all about moving our body around and maintaining an even distribution between our left and our right, weight distribution between our left and our right foot. Next time, we're going to be weighting one foot more than the other, intentionally, to get our board to lean. Okay, so it's going to be the exact opposite in terms of weight distribution to what we talked about today. Okay, so that's just looking ahead. But you've got some stuff to practice this time, and that's moving around, getting into this squared up position, getting your body out over the water, right? Getting that blade squared up and vertical without changing your weight distribution between your 2 feet, keeping it the same here as it is here when you're standing up and relaxed. Okay? So that's the drill. Happy Easter, everybody. Hope you're well. Hope you're healthy, staying healthy. Hope those that are close to you are doing the same, right? We all want to know that we're not only are we healthy, but the people that we care about are staying healthy through this pandemic as well. So I wish you all the best for Easter, and we will meet again sometime next week for Tracking Your Board Straight Part 3. All right? Happy Easter, everybody.